Thanks, Anthony. As I looked around the room earlier, they're not all back from lunch now, but I think I'm scheduled for about a half hour. I might go 2 hours. The way I figured it, I'm going to save the district about $2,000 an hour the longer that I talk. Often in integrated management and integrated management planning, people maybe don't understand what the purpose is of integrated management planning. And really, it's kind of an evolution that's occurred in Nebraska. First, groundwater and surface water were only considered separately. Then LB 108 kind of was the first effort of the legislature to draw the two together. And then, of course, before that could actually be implemented, then we had LB 962 that came into play to define the basic structure of the integrated management statutes that we operate under and plan under today. And kind of how does that impact in the real world? And some of our engineers, Tom Riley, be proud of the Venn diagram in the presentation. But, the real world is what it is, and there's only so much that we can do to influence that. Mother Nature kind of gives us the water supply that we have. Regulations, we can reduce water use, but how much does that impact consumptive use? How much does that actually impact the water supply? How do those changes in the water supply resonate through the actual physical system? Human nature, of course, is what we deal with. How do regulations really force or make changes on the people that are making decisions? Because there's always, as a producer, a desire to use the optimal amount of water today, in consideration of what the water supply in the future would be. And of course, technology's kind of the unknown. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of an example in the Republican. And, back before we worried about compact compliance so much in the early 2000s, kind of when the settlement agreement was being formed and in prior times, basically the entire water supply was available for use. There was no restriction on water use, groundwater or surface water, that was put in place to make sure we were staying in our allocation under the compact. Once we started looking at what we would have to do in the Republican, and the Plat's a little bit different, they have the program and the cooperative agreement and those things, but in the Republican, we have the compact that kind of dictates and limits how much water we can use, irrespective of how much is available. And when we looked at just general broad-based regulations on groundwater pumping throughout the basin, to be in compliance in the driest of times, which is a 2-year average, was going to require somewhere around a 60% reduction in water use across the entire basin, so that we could comply in those few years that were what we viewed as the driest years conceivable. And that was from where the water use, 60% reduction from the water use levels that we were at prior to that period, roughly 1998 through 2002. And so if you put that in perspective, without any changes in technology or management practices by producers, you're essentially going to take 60% of the irrigation off the table. Now, whether they do that by irrigating some acres, with roughly 40% as much water, or whether they reduce acres, obviously every producer is going to optimize that on their own farm and in the way that they feel is best. But you're going to see a drastic reduction. There's about 1.1 million irrigated acres, so you would take roughly 600,000 acres out of production, or the equivalent of that, if we just went with broad-based regulation across the board throughout the 4 NRDs that are in the basin. Now, we looked at other alternatives. Of course, some of these came to fruition a little bit slower than what we would have liked. But when you look at some of the things we've implemented, like the Encore project, the Rock Creek augmentation project, some of the surface water canal leasing for recharge, some of those things, the reason for that is what we kind of were able to do in our integrated management plans through conjunctive management type projects like augmentation projects was to shift that pie chart. Instead of having a 60% reduction in water use, we're looking at closer to a 25% reduction in water use from those 9802 levels, a lot of which can be achieved through adopting technologies and the best management practices out there in a lot of the areas where they weren't already the norm. And then when you look at how much water we use with those conjunctive management projects, as an example, Rock Creek and the Encore project retired roughly 21,000 acres of irrigation. And that represents somewhere pretty close to 3%, if you will, of the water supply that we've tied up through those and other conjunctive management projects. So instead of having a 60% reduction in water available for irrigation, we have a 25%, and then we had an additional 3% roughly of water that used to be used for irrigation that we now use in these conjunctive management projects. And so it's a drastic shift in the amount of water that can be used within the state of Nebraska and the Republican Basin. And as we move forward in time, people always kind of like to think, well, geez, this is the amount that we should be able to use today to grow a crop. That's where things are going to be forever. Well, that's not the case. I mean, it's in anything that employs technology for production. We don't grow the same amount of corn per inch of water today that we did in 1950. We grow a lot more corn per unit of water than what they used to. We pump a lot less water. We're more conservative with all of our inputs as producers. And so as technological advancements happen, we're not actually going to grow the pie of water. Again, Mother Nature determines what the water supply is. But the volume and the value of production that we can generate from the water that we can use will be more. And so that impacts not only the usable water, but also the water that piece of the pie that's from regulation. The amount of regulation that's necessary can be reduced through technological advancements. What those will be, who knows? When they'll come, who knows? But we do know that we have a pretty constant and consistent progression of genetics in corn and soybeans in terms of water use. And that'll continue into the future. To think that technological advancement is going to come to a standstill in America is just not supported by the history that we have. So why did the 44 elected officials in the Republican Basin that sit on NRD boards decide to take on conjunctive management projects? I think it was pretty well illustrated in those charts that it made a lot more of the available water supply available for use under the compact, and which has very broad and significant economic impacts, and that's really the bottom line of why they chose to do those. There are some other things that I'll talk about in terms of how it impacts certain water users and makes more water available than what would have been had we went through regulation only. But our history, we had leased surface water in the past for compact compliance purposes. The reliability of enough of that being available at the time that you needed it, coupled with the price that we had to pay for it, made that a less attractive option moving forward. It was indicated that may not be available to us on a willing buyer, willing seller basis moving forward. So we developed these projects of a size that basically made it such that we didn't really need to lease surface water moving forward, which would allow the surface water users to use that water. Regulations alone, again, this is kind of what our regulations are, and again, a 60% reduction from those levels is what would have been required if we would have went the sole regulation route with respect to managing groundwater for compact compliance. Within the plans, because we didn't have conjunctive management alternatives that were already constructed at the time we were formulating the plan has a backstop in it in case those projects don't get built. And that backstop was really the least economically devastating regulatory solution for compact compliance in water short years, which is to shut off the fewest number of acres possible to comply with the compact. And of course, those are the acres that are closest to the streams that have the highest immediate impact on stream flow, those wells. But all in all, there'd be roughly a little over 100,000 or right around 100,000 acres that would be shut off in the rapid response area. And the Middle Republicans' IMP would require that their entire district of 300,000 acres to be shut off. Again, irrigation retirement. is another option. We've been paying upwards of $2,300 per acre under some federal programs over the last 4 or 5 years. And honestly, we've pretty much exhausted the amount of acres and the number of acres in those high impact areas that people actually wanted to enroll. It would take much higher prices. So to achieve the same thing that we have achieved in terms of volume of water when we need it through conjunctive management projects, we'd be looking at spending $200 to $300 million on irrigation retirement versus conjunctive management projects that cost a little bit under $100 million for the Republican basin share. And the bottom line is, are there any sellers on those voluntary programs? And so because of the high cost and sort of uncertainty with respect to the volume of water that these other options have left us with, we developed the Rock Creek project, started that project, kind of laying the groundwork for that and acquiring the land in 2011 and construction in 12 and operated in 2013. But that was just for the upper Republican district and didn't cover the middle and the lowers needs for compact compliance. And Twin Plat's actually part of the INCOR project as well for them to meet their IMP obligations on the plat. Which ties in, of course, with the cooperative agreement. And here's just a map of the Lincoln Farms project that we have on INCOR. You know, it's one of the largest, if not the largest, contiguous block of irrigated land that was developed in the Sandhills in southern Lincoln County. We purchased something on the order of 115 pivots, about 16,000 irrigated acres for $81.5 million. We made an offer that was not acceptable, so we ended up paying about $83 million for the property. And it wasn't too long after we signed that contract that they had an offer for slightly above asking. There were several large potato farms that were working together to try and purchase that because there were potato storage facilities on it. You know, while we don't have a site here in southern Lincoln County, I think it's, you know, important for me to point out that this INCOR project wasn't something we just thought of overnight and did the next day. We had studied for years potential sites in the Republican basin for augmentation and kind of how augmentation would fit into the overall compliance scheme. Originally, we started out with over a dozen sites, kind of narrowed those down. Here are about 9 sites on this slide that show kind of areas that we did a little bit more formal analysis of. But 2 things became crystal clear when we went through that analysis that you need to have high capacity wells. A lot of the areas that we looked at had relatively low capacity wells, and the infrastructure would be spread out much further to generate the same volume of water. So we really figured out that you needed 2 things. You needed large blocks of irrigated land where the aquifer was such that you had high capacity wells so you could minimize your infrastructure costs. So it's no coincidence that both the Rock Creek project and the INCOR project are situated in areas where there's a relatively thick, saturated thickness in material, water-bearing material that will allow for very high capacity wells. You know, much in excess of 1,000 gallons a minute if you so desire. Just quick stats of what we purchased there on the INCOR property, you know, because it was an operating farm. Obviously, there was a lot of equipment that we don't need for augmentation, most of which has been sold off. At this point, we're currently in the process of, as you can see, the sand hills here, blowing sand around the 42-inch pipe that was installed. Really, the biggest task going on right now is we're drilling about another 10,000 acres of previously irrigated cropland back to native species to restore it to what it was before it was farmed and irrigated, which is the sandhills of Nebraska. Here's sort of a schematic of the pipeline design. The red is what's actually installed today. There are some blue lines on there that show that the trunk lines and the main line of the pipeline were constructed such that if more than the 30 wells that we currently have plumbed in and wired up were needed for timing related issues with providing water to the Platte. It's designed so that up to 40 wells could be plumbed into the existing infrastructure. None too soon did we get INCOR up and operating. I think our deadline was roughly March 1 when we needed it to be operating by, and you can see some of the very first water there coming out the end of the pipe on February 28th, and got it up to capacity shortly thereafter. But certainly in 2014, we avoided in the Republican Basin a complete irrigation shutdown on roughly 100,000 acres in the rapid response area, and an additional 200 and some thousand acres in the Middle Republican that weren't in the rapid response area. So again, I think just the economic impact that was avoided by getting that project up and going in a very timely fashion had a pretty remarkable impact on the local area and kind of holding that economy together. And I think, moving forward, I'll make a few comments on the significance of the Supreme Court decision that Ms. O'Connell spoke about, which are huge. That accounting change makes it so that these projects that were designed to provide as much as roughly 60,000 acre feet in a given year for INCOR. Last year we needed it to provide roughly 42,000 acre feet for two reasons. That accounting change had not been acknowledged by the court yet, and secondly, Kansas had not agreed with Nebraska on how much credit we should get for the augmentation deliveries. If either one of those came to be, that amount would be cut to about 30,000 roughly acre feet. With both of those things in place, last year we only would have needed to have delivered through the augmentation projects a little bit less than 20,000 acre feet, or right around 20,000 acre feet. So the Supreme Court decision we have, so that significantly changes the amount of compliance water we would need to get out of these conjunctive management projects, and is a huge benefit every year moving forward. Secondly, these temporary agreements that we've been working on with the state of Kansas, Director Schneider has been instrumental in that. By working with Kansas instead of fighting against them, and them getting the ability to store water in Harlan County and use the water when it's most valuable to them, and in turn them giving us the appropriate credit as we see it for the augmentation deliveries that we are making and the administration that the state is doing, that accounting credit is huge. On INCOR, it's almost a 2-for-1. It almost cuts the pumping required in half, the crediting for that. On Rock Creek, it's about 44% less, but those two things, the crediting issues, and if we can continue to work with Kansas on long-term agreements, and now we have the Supreme Court decision, these projects will very likely be used far less than they were designed for, both in frequency and in terms of the volume that they would need to pump for compact compliance purposes, to the point where, at least if the near future is anything like the recent past in terms of needs for compact compliance based on weather, we'll actually pump less water out of these projects moving forward than the irrigated lands that we retired for the projects would have pumped for irrigation, even in a single year, let alone on average, because there will be many years that we don't use those. So these are some of the types of projects that we're able to develop as districts in cooperation with the Department of Natural Resources to meet the objectives in our integrated management plans. Of course, the Republicans focused a lot on compact compliance. The Platte plans are obviously focused a lot more on the cooperative agreement and their IMPs and getting back to fully appropriated. So the benefits, again, of INCOR are just phenomenal. To think that we could put a project in place that could supply 60 to 80,000 acre feet worth of water in a short period of time, when before the options that we had were, very, very small amounts of water that could be provided from irrigation retirement near the stream, The rapid response shutoff of 100,000 acres, provides very little water in the first year and grows to like 30 to 40,000 acre feet over 4 or 5 years before that shows up. With these projects, we can flip a switch and measure the water that we're putting in the stream, as opposed to relying on the model being accurate as to how much will show up through other management actions, kind of a wait and see. So eliminating the uncertainty by using projects that are very controllable has very good benefits. And really the only reason that some of these projects probably didn't get developed sooner and put in place for the benefit of everyone in a more timely fashion was, and I know this is a great place to say that, but litigation. I don't think we've solved many of our problems with attorneys in the Republican Basin. It seems to be usually when the attorneys show up late for a meeting that we get something done in a positive fashion first. So that said, they did carry their water in the court case, so I'll give them that. And here's how terribly destructive these augmentation projects are, as you can see. Some people talk about all the bad things, and when you look at the Rock Creek structure, it sort of looks like a creek with water running downhill. It's not a lot different than what already occurs out there without the project. If you'd never been to Rock Creek or Medicine Creek before, you probably wouldn't know that wasn't how it always looked. So that is what we've been doing in the districts with conjunctive management projects like these, and there's a lot of projects where they've retired surface water use and converted areas to groundwater use in the plat, and those are the types of things that I think you'll see districts continuing to do under the integrated management plans that we have. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and we can field questions when he's through.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks a lot for having me here today. As you said, I'm going to talk about a rulemaking process that we've been working on for about 6 years now, and I'm going to go through a timeline of kind of how that's unfolded, briefly describe the process, the components of the rule, and then look at a survey that we conducted trying to evaluate the public opinion on the rule, especially relative to the current rule that we have, and the timeline for moving forward. Whoops. So in 2009, we finished the IMPs in the Upper Platte River Basin, as well as a basin-wide plan for the over-appropriated river basin. We got that done in 4 years and 362 days, so we had a whole 3 days to spare. We were pretty happy with that. But it was in all fairness, it was, I think at the end of that, everyone looked at everything a lot differently in terms of what we needed to be doing in the basin, and so it was a really good process. I was only involved in the tail end of it. So after that, because of some interest in being able to better quantify the difference between fully and over-appropriated, and the statutes really require that when we look at the difference between the level of development there and fully appropriated, that we use it using the rule that we use to evaluate whether or not we need to designate a basin as fully appropriated, which makes sense. You would look at everything consistently. So unfortunately, the current rule for designating a basin fully appropriated doesn't lend itself very well to evaluating that difference between over and fully appropriated. We'll use it if we have to, and I'll get to that. But there's some issues that will have to be overcome if we have to go that route. So we went through a process of looking at different concepts for how we might redevelop the rule. We had consultants that looked at various options, including looking at other Western states and how they do this type of thing, and what they basically found is they don't. It's usually by legislative fiat after all hell's broken loose in a river basin. So that's probably not the way we want to go about it here. We decided, and the legislature has directed us to actually stay ahead of that kind of stuff. So, anyway, they looked at the current rule and whether or not we could just tweak it to make it more effective, and we really didn't have any good avenues that they found with that. So we developed these new concepts that I'll describe here in a minute. In 2013, we released those draft rules. We had an informal public participation process where we gathered comments, evaluated those comments, made some changes, had a public hearing, got a lot of really good comments. There was enough there that we felt we should go back and take a harder look at those rules, see if we can improve them before adopting, if we were going to do that. Then after that, we went through another very extensive public participation process to try to help educate people on what the rules mean, how they would work, and did a survey in 2014 to look at how people viewed these rules and what was necessary for a rule, and how well those things were met, both with the current rule we have and with the proposed rule, and I'll share some of those results with you here in a minute. So here's kind of the general concepts of the rule. It looks at the basin water supply and compares that to the total demand for water under a representative period, and also, as required by statute, looks at how those things balance out both in the near term and in the long term, and also takes into account whether or not there's an IMP in place and the extent to which that provides the same protections that a fully appropriated designation would provide. And for a little context there, when the current rule was adopted, the only way you could do an IMP is if you were fully appropriated. Since then, I believe it was in 2010, we had legislation that provided for voluntary integrated management plans, and we've got most of the NRDs that aren't required to do an integrated management plan are either working on one or have one already adopted. So we felt it'd be appropriate to incorporate that aspect of the statutes into how we looked at that rule as well. So this just kind of illustrates what I'm talking about when I refer to the basin water supply. It starts out with the stream flow. We measure the stream flows in these basins, and you can look at, and I'll show you a depiction of it. You can look at all of the data that we've developed to put together the basin water supply and the total demand on our website, on our Insight website. So it starts with stream flow, adds in the surface water consumptive use, the groundwater depletions, and any required inflow. That has to do with, river basins and how downstream water users often are reliant on water supplies that originate upstream in a river basin upstream. And then for the demand, it's basically all the major water uses, that downstream demand I talked about. The surface water loss has to do with water required to basically carriage loss water in canals, to make sure that it's not just the consumptive use in the irrigation districts, but also the water they need to get the water to the fields. We have the in-stream flow demand, the hydropower demand. Those are in-stream uses, and in some cases, the same water is used for both demands, like the Loop Public Power District. Their water satisfies in-stream flow demands downstream from there. So we quantify those, and then we ensure that we're not double counting those demands by requiring different water for those demands. And then, of course, the groundwater demand, and that's the one thing that really the only thing that's different between the near term and the long term total demand. For the near term, that groundwater demand is the actual depletions that have occurred. For the long term, it's the total groundwater use in our hydrologically connected area. So it's basically the full impact of those groundwater wells if we brought the system to a steady state, and that was being realized at the stream, that full impact of the pumping. And then, of course, the surface water demand, the consumptive use related to surface water diversions. So this is some images from our Insight website that I referred to before, and then we just picked out the Little Blue River Basin. So This right here would be the near-term balance. So the blue bars mean we're using less than we have in every year. And I'll mention the representative period that I referred to before. Right now, we're using a 25-year period to represent averages because it gives you the appropriate mix of wet and dry and average years so that you're not biasing it towards a more wet or a more dry time frame when you look at the average conditions. Then the long-term balance, you can see when we add in the rest of that hydrologically connected groundwater pumping that isn't already being realized as a depletion, those blue bars get a bit shorter and some of them turn into red bars, which means those are years that we're using more than we have. And of course, that water comes from the aquifer. So the aquifer provides us that buffer to get through those dry years. But basically the main design of the rule then is if you average these out, it needs to be on average a blue bar. If it were on average a red bar, we'd be taking water out of the bank more often than we were putting water into the bank, so to speak. So that's the way it's set up to take this data and evaluate whether or not a fully appropriated designation is necessary. Oops. And I talked about the role of IMPs in a designation, and I should need to clarify the terms. The FAB report just serves as a preliminary determination. We do that. We're required to do an annual report and make any preliminary determinations that are required under our rule by the end of every year. After that happens, we're required to hold at least one public hearing in that river basin if there is a preliminary determination. And we utilize the results of the annual report as well as all of the evidence that is presented at that hearing to decide for the director to decide whether or not to make a final designation. I'm sorry, I was getting backwards too. But so you're not fully appropriated until there's that final designation. And we feel it's appropriate that if they already have an IMP in place that provides all of the protections to water users that a designation would, that what's the point of mandating something that they're already doing voluntarily? And I'm sure you can understand, the state of Nebraska is happy to do things that the feds might want us to do, but only if they don't require it. As soon as Big Brother's requiring it, you're not so sure you want to do it. And so, that's kind of the essence of that element of the rule, to avoid that conflict, which is just really unnecessary. I talked about the survey that we did, and we looked at various things like how the rules use the best available science, which is a requirement of statute, whether or not they address critical supply and demand issues, all of the things that are listed up there. And you can see the current rule, and they rank these on a scale of 1 through 5. You can see the current rule is well below average, not very favorably viewed. This survey was available to anyone who wanted to participate. And then when you compare that to the rules that we're trying to adopt, while they're not perfect, we don't have a 5.0 there, you can see that that's what I would view as a substantial improvement to the current rules we have in place. And just to go through those categories in terms of the current rules using the best available hydrologic science to determine water availability, you can see that we're using a suite of scientific data and tools to determine water availability. In terms of how they address critical supply and demand issues, we assess all current hydrologically connected water use, and they also assess focus areas for more targeted management. The existing rule requires water administration, and you look at water administration on a large basin, and you might remember when we had the preliminary determination in 2009 for the Lower Platte River Basin, that was one water user, that was the in-stream flow calling for water, and it triggered the entire basin, a huge area. this allows us to hone in on which areas really do have an imbalance and which areas don't need to be addressed at this time. And when you look at our Insight website, we've basically taken that down to subbasins. We're really limited by where we have stream gauges. So like in the Loop River Basin, we can go all the way down to the South Loop, Middle Loop, North Loop, and take it down to that level. So we think that's a really good thing. New rules should support water planners and guide future actions. These rules will allow us to dovetail directly into the planning process. You've got the data, you're looking at, okay, what's the issue? There's this imbalance, what are we gonna do about it? The current rules just really don't, in fact, they explicitly say they're not for the planning process. So you basically get a designation and then you start all over when trying to figure out what you need to do. Whoops. Rules should address water supply problems before they are critical. And these new rules would lead to more proactive determinations. And again, look at all hydrologically connected water demands. Obviously, rules should be unambiguous. We have more definition of key terms in the new rules, and they allow for a collaboration on key data used. Obviously, irrigation districts and NRDs collect a lot of data as well, and if we implement and utilize these new rules, that the provisions are there to ensure that we're using all the best data that's available. Rules should initiate water planning processes to prevent conflicts. The new rule linked to voluntary IMPs and basin plannings. They directly link to the planning framework, as I said before, and they contain new methods for monitoring. So here's a bit of information on the process going forward. As I said, we had another round of public meetings and informal information gathering from the public on what they thought of the revised rules. We basically worked through all that, and we have a draft ready to go to hearing, and we're working with the Governor's Policy Research Office to get the go-ahead for another hearing. We'll take that through hearing and look at the comments we get. We really encourage anyone to provide testimony, especially if you like the new rules. But I say that in jest, but also it's often the case that the only people that show up for these hearings are the ones that have something they don't like, and they don't take the time to come if it's something they support. So we would really appreciate your support if you do in fact support this. If we get to implement them, we will use it for our basin evaluation. That'll come out by the end of the year, and in that OA-FA determination. But we're really at a fish or cut bait point. You saw how long we've been working on this. It's been 6 years, and we've got on that OA to FA quantification. We're at a point where we can't wait any longer. So if we're not able to implement these new rules, we're just going to have to fall back on what we have on the books and go forward with that and figure out how to utilize those rules. The real issue with the current rules is it leaves a lot to the department. It's undefined. Like it talks about looking at water administration for direct diversions of the river, but for things like storage and hydropower and in-stream flow, the current rule just says the department has to come up with some standard of interference for those. So that obviously would be a real challenge and something that would be difficult to do in a manner that wasn't arbitrary. So anyway, that's our concern and why we're really hoping to get these adopted and be able to move on. So with that being said, I'm sure Jasper would be happy to answer all your questions.
Bear with me, there is a question at the end of this, but it's no secret, Jasper, that you and I have been on opposite ends of the discussion on the augmentation project, so I'm going to lay down a couple of baseline comments, and then there will be a question down here. I would like to say, however, I'm thankful that as a result, partially because of the augmentation projects, we were able to get an agreement with with DNR. Thank you, Jim, for getting the state call lifted, which has given surface water users a greater supply of water in 2015, which, as I see it, is the way these projects should work, that complements both sources of water. So thank you for that. There were some gaping holes in your presentation, Jasper, that really doesn't talk about the impact of those decisions on surface water, greatly diminishing their supply. A Q&A forum isn't really the place to air that, but I would be happy to visit with anyone after the conference that would fill in those gaping holes. Which leads me to the question, the three primary NRDs, the Republican Basin, agreed to reduce their pumping standard compliance by 25% in the 2010 and through 2015 year. And we know that the NRDs have chosen to ignore their own rule in this. But my question is, if you had chosen to abide by your own rules, would the augmentation waters have been totaled in that new pumping standard?
Steve, I think it's unfair to say that we have ignored our rule. Specifically, the integrated management plan, the section that talks about those pumping standards, is to a 25% reduction over the long term, and it wasn't spelled out in those integrated management plans that was a 5-year average, as you've indicated that it was. And so the nexus here, what the pumping reduction was required for, was if we didn't take other actions and only relied upon regulation over the long term, we knew that additional pumping reductions over that period of time would be necessary to offset any potential increase in lag effect across the basin. And obviously we have put other projects in place to make those reductions not as important in terms of compliance. But again, the target is still there, but it's not a 5-year average in the plan, it's over the long term. And the only time that I'm aware that like in our district, I think, as an example, the 25% reduction was not met in, believe it or not, 2012, the driest year ever, when pumping was higher, and the immediately following year, 2013, when it was pretty dry. But in all other years to date, we've met our target or exceeded our target on that. And so I really think that we are in pretty good shape of meeting that moving forward over the long term.
Regardless of whether or not it's part of that pumping standard compliance or not, I was pleased to hear that you indicated that you thought that perhaps you pump less water than if the plant is left in production. But are the pumping numbers for the augmentation project calculated in the overall pumping for compact compliance?
Yes, the pumping of augmentation projects is included in the pumping that goes into the compact compliance calculations.
And over time, those numbers will, so the pumping that we do this year for augmentation, it'll be visited in the accounting in years going forward, just through the model and through the pumping, right?
Right, and as part of our application to the RRCA for our augmentation plans, we did a pretty extensive analysis of the effect of the change in operations, and in fact, we put in a pumping pattern that exceeded historic consumptive use for purposes of illustrating the minimal impact that would have. And the largest thing that happens with the change in operations is the depletions happen at slightly different times, but it's the depletions that happen because of those augmentation projects, with an increase in consumptive use, are still almost exactly the same as what they would have been if the farming operation had just continued.
This is a question for Jasper. And as you well know, Senator Christensen and I guess I'll use the term instrumental. I don't know how proud I am of that, but we helped bring about the bill that allowed you to put a big tax on irrigated land, the occupation tax, up to $10 an acre. And in these days when grain prices are down and land values are up, it makes it an even more difficult tax, I think, to pay. So I don't know how proud I am of helping you out that way. But you're doing that to take care of a state obligation. And there was no resident in the Republican Basin that signed that original agreement in our compact with Kansas and Colorado. Is it fair for you to continue to pay the bill? Or should the state be a participant in that? And if the state should be a participant, how do you win that argument?
Well, since I work for a local board and you're asking if the local board would like the state to pick up the bill, the answer would probably be yes, depending on what strings come with that. I often say federal money is usually too expensive even when they say it's free. And the same can be true with state money. The state has paid some costs, but as you're fully aware, Senator Carlson, not nearly as much as the local people have paid. I do think that your question is ripe with the ongoing discussions and funding issues related to water in the state. Certainly the fund that you created last year through legislation and those funds arguably should be considered for projects that local entities are currently paying for. When and if the right time to have that discussion is now or next year, I don't know. But I certainly do think there's a bigger role for state funding in water projects throughout the state of Nebraska.
One thing I think that's interesting about INCOR is the vast sort of contiguous area that's now not in production. Are you guys learning anything about sort of redeploying resources and what their value might be for things like hunting and bird watching and that sort of stuff? Or is it just at this point sort of, let's get the augmentation going and we'll worry about redeploying the resource later?
Obviously, the primary focus has been on getting the project up and going. We are working with Game and Parks right now on a cooperative agreement to, as I mentioned, the entire 16,000 acres that used to be irrigated is being repurposed as native rangeland, and we're seeding that. But we're working with Game and Parks on an open walk-in access hunting for about just pretty close to 10,000 acres, and we've made similar offers to them on about 2,000 acres of our Rock Creek project. So there are other non-ag uses of the land that some people may benefit from as well, but those are certainly not the primary focus of the projects.
Any thoughts on using that as for paid hunting or things that generate real income?
There has been some discussion on that. Obviously, as a public entity, we didn't necessarily want to step out and do the private hunting leases when we had the opportunity to make it available to the public.
Oh, I had one other one. In terms of overall, I guess it's hard to quantify what the volume necessary from the augmentation project will be on an annual basis, but if we averaged, I don't know, if we used last year's augmentation numbers, how much water we pumped out at NCORP, how long would the water supply that's there last?
Yeah, I think that it's basically, it's a sustainable water supply by most definitions that I've heard. They're sitting on a pile of water, and I think the only thing that could really impact the project's operations is if NPPD over there shut down their system and stopped contributing that Platte River water to the mound. You know, it's like 50 feet up from pre-development in that area, so.
It ranges from 20 to 40 or 50.
Yeah, so it'd take an awful long time with that project shut down just to get back, and with that project and with NCOR operating just to get back to pre-development, and then you're still sitting on 500 feet. Yeah. Well beyond the useful life of the project.
Other questions? All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.